Have you ever wondered if we are living in prophetic times? What if the passing of Pope Francis is not just a historical event, but the fulfillment of a long-forgotten prophecy spoken by John Paul II? Today, we'll explore a spiritual mystery that has profound implications for our lives, our future, and perhaps even our salvation. As the world mourns the loss of Pope Francis, who passed away at the age of 88 just yesterday, many spiritual seekers are beginning to connect dots that have remained hidden for decades. This isn't about fear or sensationalism. It's about understanding the spiritual signs that shape our reality and guide our journey toward truth. Robert Thompson from Chicago was never particularly interested in prophecies or religious predictions. At 62, he was focused on his retirement plans and managing his investments. "I was always practical," he told me during our conversation last month. "I believed in God, attended church occasionally, but prophecies, that was for doomsday, preppers, and conspiracy theorists." Then, while organizing his late father's belongings, Robert found a book about John Paul II's prophecies. Initially skeptical, he began reading it out of respect for his father's faith. "What struck me wasn't just the accuracy of these prophecies," Robert explained, "but how they changed my perspective on everything, my priorities, how I viewed my finances, even how I approached my health." Robert described how reading about John Paul II's spiritual insights led him to reassess his retirement goals. He realized he had been planning for financial security without considering his spiritual legacy. "I was saving money, but starving my soul," he said with remarkable candor. John Paul II, born Karol Wojtyla in Poland, was not just a religious leader, but a mystic with profound spiritual insights. Many believe he foresaw major world events, including the fall of communism, the challenges facing modern families, and even aspects of his own papacy. But perhaps his most enigmatic prophecy was delivered during a visit to Fulda, Germany, in 1980, when he was asked about the third secret of Fatima. Hey friends, I'd really appreciate if you could hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our upcoming videos on spiritual wisdom. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you think about these prophecies. Drop a comment below and join our growing community of spiritual seekers. In that remarkable conversation at Fulda, John Paul II said something that has haunted religious scholars for decades. "We must be prepared to undergo great trials in the not-too-distant future. Trials that will require us to be ready to give up even our lives. Your prayers are needed to help me answer that which I cannot answer alone." Many interpret this as a vision of a coming spiritual confrontation, the very confrontation we may now be witnessing. But what does this have to do with Pope Francis and his recent passing? The connection lies in another prophecy attributed to Saint Malachi from the 12th century, which lists 112 popes until the end of time. According to many interpretations, Pope Francis fits the description of the final pope. On this list, Petrus Romanus, or Peter the Roman, who would feed his flock amid many tribulations, after which the seven-hilled city will be destroyed and the dreadful judge will judge the people. While the Catholic Church doesn't officially endorse this prophecy, it has been studied by religious scholars for centuries. John Paul II was certainly aware of it, and many believe his warnings about a final confrontation were influenced by this ancient text. Beyond these explicit prophecies, John Paul II frequently spoke about a time of purification for the Church and the world. In his book, Crossing the Threshold of Hope, he reflected on the approaching third millennium, with both optimism and caution, suggesting humanity was at a crucial spiritual crossroads. Thomas Williams, a retired physician from Boston, found that these spiritual insights changed not just his faith, but his approach to health. When I read John Paul's teachings about suffering having meaning and purpose, it transformed how I viewed my own health challenges, he explained during our interview. At 71, Thomas had been battling chronic pain for years. I had been angry at God, angry at my body. I spent thousands on treatments seeking only relief, not understanding. After immersing himself in John Paul II's theology of suffering, Thomas developed what he calls a spiritual health practice. He still takes his medications and follows his doctor's advice, but he also incorporates prayer, meditation on scripture, and acts of service into his health regimen. My pain hasn't disappeared, he acknowledges, but my suffering has purpose now. John Paul taught that our physical challenges can become spiritual opportunities. This integration of spiritual wisdom with practical health approaches was a hallmark of John Paul II's teaching. Unlike some spiritual leaders who focus solely on the afterlife, he emphasized the unity of body and spirit, what he called the theology of the body. He believed physical health was important, not as an end in itself, but as part of our total human dignity. The same integrated approach characterized John Paul's teachings about wealth and material possessions. He neither condemned wealth nor glorified poverty for its own sake. Instead, he taught what might be called spiritual economics, the idea that material resources should serve human flourishing and dignity. Susan Reynolds, a financial advisor from Atlanta, restructured her entire practice after studying John Paul's economic teachings. I used to help clients maximize wealth accumulation, period, she explained. Now I help them align their finances with their deepest values. Susan describes how she encourages clients to consider what she calls the spiritual return on investment, how their financial decisions impact their relationships, community, and spiritual well-being. This approach has proven particularly meaningful for her older clients. As people enter their 60s and 70s, they often realize that financial security alone doesn't bring fulfillment, Susan notes. They want their money to create meaning, not just more money. As we reflect on the passing of Pope Francis and consider John Paul II's prophecies about these times, we might ask ourselves, what if these spiritual leaders were trying to prepare us not for the end of the world, but for a new way of living in it? What if the true prophecy wasn't about dates and events, but about a call to live with greater awareness of the spiritual dimension in all aspects of our lives? The death of a pope is always a significant moment for the Catholic Church and the wider world. But when viewed through the lens of prophecy and spiritual discernment, the passing of Pope Francis takes on even deeper significance. It invites us to look beyond the immediate news cycle and consider the spiritual currents flowing beneath the surface of our times. John Paul II once said something profound that connects directly to our current moment. We are now standing in the face of the greatest historical confrontation humanity has ever experienced. I do not think that wide circles of American society or wide circles of the Christian community realize this fully. We are now facing the final confrontation between the church and the anti-church, of the gospel versus the anti-gospel. He spoke these words not as Pope, but as Cardinal Wojtyla in 1976, addressing American bishops. The remarkable thing is that he saw this confrontation coming decades in advance. This vision of a final confrontation takes on new urgency with the passing of Pope Francis. If we consider the prophecy of Saint Malachi, which many spiritual scholars believe John Paul II took seriously, Francis may represent the closing of an era, possibly even the final pope before a period of great spiritual testing for the Church and humanity. What's truly fascinating about John Paul's prophecies is that they were never solely focused on doom or destruction. Rather, they were calls to spiritual awakening, invitations to recognize the eternal significance of our everyday choices. This is where his wisdom becomes practical for our lives today. regardless of your faith background or religious affiliation. David Martinez, a construction worker from Phoenix, shared how this prophetic perspective transformed his financial mindset. "I always lived paycheck to paycheck," he admitted during our conversation. At 56, David had accumulated significant debt and had almost nothing saved for retirement. "I thought spiritual matters and money matters were completely separate. John Paul's teachings showed me they're actually connected." Inspired by the Pope's writings on authentic human development, David began making changes. He started viewing his finances through a spiritual lens, not as separate from his faith, but as an expression of it. "I realized my spending habits reflected my values, or lack of them," he explained. David created a financial plan that aligned with his spiritual priorities. He began systematically paying down debt, setting aside money for charitable giving, even while on a tight budget, and making modest retirement contributions. "The interesting thing is, when I began handling money as a spiritual practice, my financial stress decreased dramatically," he said. "I sleep better now, even though I'm not wealthy by any means." Research confirms David's experience. Studies consistently show that financial decisions aligned with personal values lead to greater satisfaction and reduced anxiety, regardless of income level. This integration of spiritual wisdom with practical finances was an important theme in John Paul II's teachings. In his encyclical Centesimus Annus, he wrote about economic systems that should consider the whole person and all dimensions of his life. He criticized both unchecked capitalism that treats people as mere consumers and socialist systems that deny human freedom. Instead, he advocated for what we might call spiritual economics, an approach that respects human dignity and serves the common good. As we consider these teachings in light of current events and prophecies, an important pattern emerges. John Paul II wasn't simply predicting future events. He was highlighting eternal principles that become especially crucial during times of transition and crisis. His prophetic voice reminds us that spiritual preparation is the most essential form of readiness for whatever lies ahead. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a geriatric specialist from Seattle, applies this integrated wisdom in her medical practice. "Many of my patients are in their 70s and 80s, she explained. They face health challenges that can't be addressed through medication alone. Inspired by John Paul's teachings on suffering and dignity, Dr. Chen developed what she calls a whole-person health approach that addresses physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. I've noticed that patients who maintain spiritual practices tend to experience better health outcomes," she observed. "They recover more quickly from illnesses, report less pain, and generally maintain better cognitive function." Scientific research increasingly supports these observations. Studies published in journals like JAMA Internal Medicine have found positive associations between religious involvement and better health outcomes, including lower blood pressure, stronger immune function, and reduced anxiety. Dr. Chen encourages her patients to view health challenges through a spiritual lens, not as punishment, but as opportunities for growth. John Paul II lived this reality, she noted. Even as his health declined in his final years, he continued to find meaning and purpose in his suffering. This approach doesn't deny medical realities or discourage proper treatment. Rather, it complements medical care with spiritual resources that enhance resilience and well-being. This holistic perspective reflects John Paul's frequent teaching that the human being is a single creature composed of body and soul. He rejected both materialistic views that reduce people to their physical components and overly spiritualized perspectives that neglect bodily needs. Instead, he advocated caring for the whole person, an approach that becomes increasingly valuable as we age and face inevitable health challenges. Now, as we witness what may be the fulfillment of ancient prophecies with the passing of Pope Francis, we might ask how John Paul's integrated wisdom applies to our current moment. If we are indeed entering the final confrontation he foresaw, what does that mean for our everyday lives? James Wilson, a retired teacher from Denver, found clarity about this question after a health scare forced him to reevaluate his priorities. "I had a minor heart attack at 64, he shared. Suddenly, all my careful financial planning and retirement savings didn't seem so important." During his recovery, James began reading John Paul II's writings on suffering and redemption. "What struck me was how practical his spiritual wisdom was," James recalled. "He taught that suffering isn't meaningless, but can be transformed when united with Christ's suffering." This perspective helped James view his health challenge not as an interruption to his life plans, but as a redirection toward greater purpose. James began integrating spiritual practices with his cardiac rehabilitation program. Alongside exercise and dietary changes, he incorporated prayer, meditation, and acts of service. "My cardiologist was skeptical at first," James laughed, "but he's impressed with my progress." More importantly, James found new meaning and purpose through this integrated approach. "I realized I had been saving money for retirement, but not preparing my soul for eternity," he reflected. This spiritual preparation becomes especially relevant when we consider John Paul's prophecies about the final confrontation. If we are indeed witnessing the fulfillment of St. Malachi's prophecy with the end of Pope Francis's papacy, how should we respond? John Paul's answer was clear. Not with fear or apocalyptic panic, but with deepened faith and practical spiritual discipline. In his book Memory and Identity, John Paul wrote about historical turning points. "Evil, in fact, is always defeated by good. This is the great privilege granted to man. He can overcome evil with good." This optimistic realism characterized his prophetic vision. While he foresaw difficult times ahead, he never doubted the ultimate triumph of good. Patricia Rodriguez, a nurse from Miami, applied this perspective to her family's financial challenges during the economic downturn of 2020. "We lost significant income when my husband was furloughed," she explained. "At 59, we worried our retirement plans were permanently derailed." Rather than succumbing to anxiety, Patricia drew inspiration from John Paul's teachings about providence and trust. "We reassessed our finances from a spiritual perspective," she said. "We distinguished between wants and needs, practiced gratitude for what remained, and looked for opportunities to help others despite our own situation. This approach didn't magically restore their savings, but it transformed their experience of financial hardship from crisis to opportunity. We discovered resources we didn't know we had, not just financial resources, but spiritual and communal ones," Patricia noted. As we reflect on the possible prophetic significance of Pope Francis's passing, this integrated wisdom becomes increasingly valuable. If St. Malachi's prophecy and John Paul's warnings about a final confrontation are indeed unfolding, the most important preparation involves aligning our entire lives, spiritual, financial, and physical, with eternal values. Robert Jenkins, a hospice chaplain from Charlotte, witnesses this alignment daily in his work with the dying. "People facing death rarely worry about their investment portfolios or career achievements," he observed. "They focus on relationships, forgiveness, and spiritual peace." Robert believes John Paul's prophetic warnings were ultimately invitations to live each day with this end-of-life clarity. John Paul saw that modern society encourages us to invest everything in temporary concerns while neglecting eternal ones, Robert explained. His prophecies were meant to wake us up to the ultimate reality we all eventually face. This awakening doesn't require abandoning practical concerns about health or finances. Rather, it means addressing these concerns within a larger spiritual framework that gives them proper perspective. The profound connection between John Paul II's prophecies and the death of Pope Francis becomes even clearer when we examine the Fatima revelations. In 1917, 3 shepherd children in Fatima, Portugal, reported visions of the Virgin Mary, who entrusted them with 3 secrets. The third secret, revealed during John Paul's papacy in 2000, described a bishop dressed in white who would be killed. Many initially interpreted this as predicting John Paul's attempted assassination in 1981, an event he survived despite severe injuries. However, John Paul himself suggested a broader interpretation. He believed the third secret of Fatima wasn't about a single event, but symbolized the Church's journey through trials and persecution. In his reflection on the secret, he wrote, "The blood of martyrs is the seed of the Church." This perspective suggests that the Fatima vision might extend beyond his own experience to include future papacies, perhaps even pointing to our current moment with the passing of Pope Francis. Margaret Sullivan, a retired nurse from Philadelphia, found this prophetic dimension of John Paul's teachings particularly meaningful during her own health crisis. "I was diagnosed with breast cancer at 62, she shared during our conversation. "Initially, I was overwhelmed with fear and questions about why this was happening to me." Through a prayer group at her church, Margaret was introduced to John Paul's writings on suffering. His letter, Salvifici Doloris, completely transformed my approach to illness, she explained. "Instead of seeing my cancer as meaningless suffering, I began to view it as an opportunity to participate in Christ's redemptive work." This perspective didn't diminish Margaret's commitment to medical treatment. She underwent surgery and chemotherapy as recommended by her doctors, but it provided a spiritual framework that complemented her physical healing journey. "I discovered that spiritual and physical health are interconnected," Margaret reflected. "When I found meaning in my suffering through prayer and service to others facing similar challenges, my physical symptoms of anxiety and depression decreased significantly." Research supports Margaret's experience. Studies consistently show that finding meaning in suffering improves both mental and physical health outcomes during serious illness. This integration of spiritual insight with practical health approaches exemplifies John Paul's prophetic wisdom. He didn't just predict future events. He provided a framework for navigating them with courage and purpose. His teachings offer what we might call prophetic medicine, healing wisdom, particularly suited for challenging times. Thomas Reed, a financial advisor from Austin, applies similar principles in guiding clients through economic uncertainty. "When the market experiences volatility, people often react from fear," he observed. John Paul's teachings about providence and eternal perspective help create financial resilience. Thomas encourages clients to develop what he calls prophetic financial planning, an approach that integrates practical money management with spiritual values. "True financial security isn't just about accumulating wealth," Thomas explained. "It's about aligning resources with purpose." He helps clients distinguish between needs and wants, prioritize generosity even during tight times, and develop spending habits that reflect their deepest values. When finances are integrated with faith, people make more consistent decisions and experience less anxiety about the future, he noted. This stability becomes especially valuable during times of transition and uncertainty, precisely the times John Paul prophetically addressed in his teachings. If we are indeed witnessing the fulfillment of ancient prophecies with the death of Pope Francis, financial decisions aligned with eternal values provide an anchor amid changing circumstances. William Parker, a hospice director from Minneapolis, witnesses this spiritual practical integration daily in his work with terminal patients. People approaching death gain remarkable clarity about what truly matters, he observed. Suddenly, relationships take precedence over possessions, reconciliation becomes more important than achievement, and spiritual peace outweighs financial security. William believes John Paul's prophetic warnings about a final confrontation were essentially invitations to live with this end-of-life clarity throughout our journey. Why wait until you're dying to prioritize what truly matters? He asked rhetorically. John Paul's prophecies call us to live with eternity in mind, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. This wisdom applies particularly to health decisions as we age. John Paul II himself modeled this integrated approach during his final illness. Rather than hiding his Parkinson's disease and physical decline, he allowed the world to witness his suffering. In doing so, he demonstrated that human dignity doesn't depend on physical capability or productivity. Dr. Sophia Martinez, a geriatrician from Chicago, applies this principle in her practice. Many of my elderly patients fear becoming burdens due to health limitations, she explained. John Paul's example shows that vulnerability can become a powerful witness to human dignity. Dr. Martinez encourages patients to address practical health needs, while also nurturing spiritual resources that provide resilience and purpose amid physical decline. I've observed that patients with strong spiritual practices generally experience better health outcomes, she noted. They're more consistent with medications, more engaged in physical therapy, and report greater overall satisfaction with life despite health challenges. Scientific research increasingly confirms these observations. A meta-analysis published in JAMA Psychiatry found that religious involvement is associated with better mental health, less substance abuse, and greater longevity. As we consider these integrated approaches to health and finances in light of John Paul's prophecies, an important pattern emerges. The final confrontation he foresaw isn't primarily an external event, but an internal choice. The decision to align our entire lives with eternal values rather than temporary concerns. If St. Malachi's prophecy about Pope Francis being the final pope before a period of judgment is indeed unfolding, the question becomes, how do we prepare? John Paul's answer was clear, not through fear or withdrawal, but through deepened faith expressed in practical action. Sarah Jenkins, a community organizer from Seattle, found this prophetic perspective transformative during financial hardship. My husband and I both lost our jobs during the pandemic, she shared. At 53, we had to completely reimagine our financial future. Initially overwhelmed by anxiety, Sarah found strength through John Paul's teachings about providence and human dignity. We realized that true security doesn't come from money in the bank, she explained. It comes from faith, community, and purpose. Sarah and her husband made practical adjustments, downsizing their home, reducing expenses, and developing new skills. But they also strengthened spiritual practices and community connections that provided resilience amid uncertainty. John Paul taught that economic systems should serve human flourishing, not the other way around, Sarah noted. We applied that principle to our personal finances, asking how our resources could best serve our true purpose. This integrated approach didn't immediately solve their financial challenges, but it transformed their experience from crisis to opportunity for growth. As we witness what may be the fulfillment of ancient prophecies with the passing of Pope Francis, this integrated wisdom becomes increasingly valuable. The final confrontation John Paul foresaw requires preparation on multiple levels: spiritual, financial, and physical. Michael Thompson, a retired military officer from Colorado Springs, summarizes this integrated preparation. John Paul didn't just warn about coming trials. He provided a roadmap for navigating them with dignity and purpose. Michael applies this wisdom through what he calls whole life stewardship, caring for spiritual, physical, and financial resources as gifts meant to serve a greater purpose. At 68, I've learned that preparation for eternity isn't separate from daily life, Michael reflected. It happens through ordinary choices about health, money, and relationships. This integrated perspective echoes John Paul's frequent teaching that holiness is found not in extraordinary experiences, but in living ordinary life with extraordinary love. As we conclude our exploration of John Paul II's prophecies and their connection to Pope Francis's passing, we're left with profound questions. What if these prophecies aren't primarily about predicting external events, but about inviting us to live with greater awareness of the spiritual dimension in all aspects of life? What if the final confrontation is happening not just in world events, but within each human heart? If St. Malachi's prophecy about Pope Francis being the final pope is indeed unfolding, the most important response isn't speculation about the future, but transformation in the present. John Paul's prophetic wisdom calls us to integrate spiritual truth with practical action, to care for our health as stewards of divine gifts, to manage finances with eternal perspective, and to find purpose in both joy and suffering. This integrated approach doesn't guarantee freedom from challenges. Indeed, if we're entering the times of trial John Paul foresaw, difficulties may intensify. But his prophetic message offers something more valuable than escape from hardship. It provides meaning and purpose amid it. As we reflect on these prophecies in light of current events, perhaps the most important question isn't whether Pope Francis was the last pope, but whether we're living as if eternity matters. John Paul's prophetic vision challenges us to align every dimension of life, spiritual, physical, and financial, with eternal values that transcend changing circumstances. In the end, the true fulfillment of prophecy may not be in dramatic, external events, but in transformed hearts and lives. As John Paul himself often said, the future starts today, not tomorrow. Whatever trials lie ahead, this integrated wisdom prepares us to face them with courage, purpose, and hope.